Dr. Davidson is Senior Fellow for Defense Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her areas of expertise include defense strategy and policy, military operations, national security, and civil military relations. Holder of a PhD and master's degree from the University of South Carolina, and, interestingly enough, a BS in architectural engineering from the University of Colorado Boulder. So this would be nation building. Yeah, that's pretty random. That's pretty good. But before, it gets better. Before joining the Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Davidson was an assistant professor in the School of Public Policy at George Mason University, where she taught courses on national security, civil military relations, among others. From 2009 to 2012, she served in the Obama administration as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Plans, where she oversaw the development of guidance for military campaign and contingency plans. She also led policy efforts for U.S. global defense posture, including the military's rebalance to Asia and international agreements related to U.S. forces stationed overseas. Before that, she served as Director for Stability Operations Capabilities in the Office of Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations and Low-Intensity Conflict, which is an awful lot of capital letters, where she founded and directed the Consortium for Complex Operations, an innovative interagency project to enhance education, training, coordination, and performance in complex emergencies and interventions. And in addition to those and other activities, Dr. Davidson began her career in the United States Air Force, where she was an aircraft commander and senior pilot for the C-130 and C-17 cargo aircraft. She flew combat support and humanitarian air mobility missions in Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, and was an instructor pilot at the U.S. Air Force Academy. Her recent publications are on civil military relations, Beyond the Last Resort, the U.S. Military and Conflict Prevention, Obama's New Global Posture, The Logic of U.S. Foreign Deployments, and Making Government Work, Pragmatic Priorities for Interagency Coordination, which she published in Orbis back in 2009. Her 2010 book, Lifting the Fog of Peace, How Americans Learned to Fight Modern War, was published by the University of Michigan Press. In 2012, Dr. Davidson was awarded the Secretary of Defense Medal for Outstanding Public Service, and in 2013, she was appointed by President Obama as a member of the National Commission on the Structure of the Air Force. We are delighted to have her here this afternoon to talk to us on the savage wars of peacekeeping, where she will talk about filling full the mouth of famine and probably the problems of sloth and heathen folly. So thank you very much, Dr. Davidson.
Wow, that was the long bio. Sorry about that. Well, it's a pleasure to be here today, to be the last speaker of the day. I know that's often a challenge. If anybody feels like they need to get up and do some yoga stretches, feel free to do that. Thank you for inviting me. This has been it's really an interesting opportunity to come and talk to all of you, to teach high school, which I think is awesome. And I'm very happy to see so many women in the room, because as you know, in this particular field, as you can tell, there aren't as many women. And so I hope that you take this sort of engagement back to your students so we can change that in the next generation. But anyway, what I want to talk about today is not so much the details of every single operation that happened in the 90s, but what I want to do is talk more broadly about what it means and what the military got out of it and what we have all gotten out of it. And let me start by bringing us back. I mean, your students are, they weren't even alive in the 90s, and I feel like it was just yesterday. And so this is the part of the history lesson that we all have really lived through, all of us in this room. So I hope maybe we'll have a vibrant discussion about the narrative that I present and whether or not it's the same narrative that you think we should take away from it. Let's take us back to November 9th, 1989, when the Berlin Wall came down. And we think about this as ushering in a new world order. That's what George Bush said. People talked about the end of history. I think about this whole decade. I look back in retrospect, I think of it as sort of the decade of denial. It was really, as my book is titled, it was really a decade of fog in some ways, where as I'll point out, there are these competing narratives happening. There are competing things happening that influence the way in which we use our military force and the way in which the military and the national security establishment sort of responds to this. So the Berlin Wall comes down, and we're thinking, great, we won, this is going to be great. 1 month later, though, people forget this happened around the same time, we invade Panama, which was supposed to be, as the general was pointing out, one of our decisive wars. But really, when you look at that, it was also sort of a precursor to what was to come. It wasn't anything like the Iraq War that we heard about. It was kind of messy. It was urban. There were civilians. And if you read the after-action reports from that Panama event, there was a lot of mistakes made. We sort of got lucky. The same sort of mistakes that were made in the aftermath of the invasion of Iraq. You know, they weren't really thinking about what came next. They were just thinking about the initial invasion, lots of miscommunication. And so we see these two sort of things happening right about the same time, and then 1 year later, we have Desert Storm, which we heard about, which in my mind sort of moving into the 90s lulls us into a false sense of reality, because as the general pointed out, you know, it was the perfect nail for our hammer. But then what did we encounter in the next entire decade? Nothing really like that. So today what I want to talk about is what we encountered and what we sort of did during that decade and why we found ourselves in this environment. I don't think people necessarily think about it that way. I'll think about it with respect to the civil-military dynamics and the debates that were going on, and also the geopolitical perspectives. What were sort of the drivers of change? And how the 90s, then how this experience resonated beyond. What did we take away from this? How do we make sense of it? And the myths that we crafted, especially in the military, about these kinds of operations and how they really came back to bite us in Iraq in some ways, but in other ways, how that experience kind of helped us in Iraq. So what happens? The wall comes down. There's strategic ambiguity. There's the sense that we are in a victorious moment. We want to expand NATO. Why? We're not quite sure. The sense that these multilateral institutions are going to help us. Most of us lived through this time. Like I said, we're going to have different narratives. But for your students, it's very much ancient history, right? This is 1992? 22 years ago? So they weren't even really around then. 1992 is when we have the Balkans begin. People think of it as later than that because that's when we have I-4 and S-4. But really this happens in 1992. So all this is happening in the George Bush administration, right? We've got the first Gulf War. We've got Panama right before that when he's still in the administration. We have the beginning of the Balkans. And we also have the beginning of Somalia. All happens in that 1992, those two operations. We think of that as sort of the Clinton era, but really it's the Bush era. And there was this sense, I think, that we won, we're the sole superpower, we have responsibility. There's bad things happening. And so we see this urge to sort of do something. It's kind of like the do something syndrome. But as we'll talk about, the do something syndrome that permeates throughout the 90s sort of butts up against things like the Vietnam syndrome and then later the Vietmalia syndrome. 1994 is when we have Haiti. There's a coup. We decide we're going to go in there and restore, uphold democracy is what it's called. And then there's in 1994, which is not part of the title of the talk, Rwanda happens, the Rwanda genocide in 1994. Right at the same time as we're thinking about whether to go into Bosnia and how we're going to engage in Bosnia and whether we should or shouldn't, we have Rwanda. Rwanda, which comes on the heels of Somalia, right? And remember what happens in Somalia. There's a famine, just to remind you, which is driven by a lot of competition among warlords. We think that we can go in there and, as my friend who was on the ground with the UN says, stop a famine in its tracks. And turns out we can. But then what happens? It's like you have a tourniquet, your hand on a tourniquet, and you have to take it off. And no sooner do we get on the ground there that we recognize that we can't leave without sort of getting at the root causes, and we sort of stumble into this big mess, right? We find ourselves chasing down warlords. We have images on TV of the Black Hawk Down incident, and that just completely freaks us out. Right? We're just like, what are we getting ourselves into? We shouldn't be doing this kind of thing. And then 2 years later comes Rwanda. And we just had the big anniversary of the Rwanda genocide just this month. Strange things always happen in April for some reason. And that incident really sort of resonates and reverberates on, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. In 1996, we continue on with Bosnia. We have the implementation force and then the stability force. And a lot of these episodes sort of demonstrate both the tension between the zeal to do something, right, to save lives with force, as Mike O'Hanlon used to say, and at the same time the sort of impotence that sometimes we find, not only with Rwanda, but that also in Bosnia, where we have another great genocide, which was the Srebrenica incident. And to remind you what happened there, we've got peacekeepers on the ground where a massive execution, massacre of Bosnians happens, and the peacekeepers are out of weapons. They're not authorized to do anything about it, and they basically are just completely helpless as this unfolds. And this not only motivates people to want to do more on the one hand, but also then sort of taints the idea of the UN peacekeeping. So that was just sort of like a broad, very super broad overview of the events to get the chronology in your head. But let me just talk about the sort of common characteristics of these missions that were happening in the 1990s. Compared to the Cold War, compared to the examples that we heard earlier today from the general, they're a lot more open-ended. It's hard to say, what's the end state here. They're more multilateral. We decide we don't want to necessarily go in without partners and allies. They're motivated by humanitarian issues. We have limited mandates to act. There's definitely a sense of casualty aversion, and this reverberates very much so on the ground with our soldiers who have this sense that we're here to protect ourselves, and we can't really operate. It's very, very much of a contrast, especially in Bosnia, between the United States military and the UK that are out and engaging with the population, and the U.S. military having to sort of hold back. And a lot of this because of the massive casualty aversion. So also the scope of these missions between Somalia and Haiti, and especially in the Balkans where we had thousands of soldiers and an airman position there, the scope of these kinds of operations is a lot broader than it was during the Cold War. During the Cold War, you had some of these sorts of messy sort of operations, but they were usually conducted by special operations forces or small teams of advisors, like in El Salvador or things like that. But now we have not just the special operations forces. We have light infantry and basically all of the general purpose forces, tanks, artillery, everybody gets their shot at having to do one of these rotations. It's considered everybody's job. Even the reserves are engaged. So now you have a whole generation of military folks that are being exposed to this these kinds of operations. And at the same time, there's this hesitancy about what we're supposed to be doing. There's very much of an aversion to what's called nation building. So it's really unclear for the poor soldiers on the ground what the heck they're supposed to be doing in Bosnia, especially. Major General Nash, who was the first one to be the commander of I-4, went in and was completely badgered by the media about whether he was going to be doing nation building in the Balkans, and he said, well, if you see my guys building a bridge or two, it'll be for combat operations, don't you worry. Because he knew he was going to have to be doing some reconstruction, but he knew it wasn't going to be a very popular thing to do. The other characteristic of these types of missions is that it's certainly not what they trained for, not all of them. In my book, I talk about how the Special Forces and the Light Infantry had a lot more exposure to this kind of training at the JRTC, the Joint Readiness Training Center, but the rest of the forces really did not. There's a great quotation by the military commander who was in charge of the operation in Haiti, and he said, you know, all my life, I dreamed of, leading troops in combat or going into a big operation. That I always assumed that I would have the 10th Mountain Division on my right and the 82nd Airborne on my left. And when I went into Haiti, I had USAID on my right and a bunch of mishmash of NGOs on my left. And how am I supposed to deal with this? They don't work for me. What are we supposed to do? And so there's all these confusing experiences happening with this generation where they're trying to make sense of it. The interesting thing to me is that this was sort of the primary mission of this generation of the 1990s. It certainly was for me. That was when I was in the Air Force. And I remember as an Air Force pilot constantly doing missions to places like the Balkans, and my commanders saying to me things like, well, this is cutting into our training, for our real mission. And I kept thinking, like, what is our real mission? Because it seems to me like this is kind of kicking our ass, and it's really hard, and we're constantly doing it, but we haven't changed the way we operate. We haven't changed the way we schedule our planes, So what am I missing here? And I think there's a sort of a generation of us that had that same sort of experience, whether it was on the ground or in the air. So what's driving this sort of confusion, okay? Meanwhile, while all of us military are out in Somalia, the Balkans, Haiti, doing all these other things, back in Washington there was a whole completely different conversation going on. The wall comes down and there's a sense of, hey, we won. That means what? Anybody? What? Cut the military. Peace dividend, that's right. Without hardly any debate whatsoever about what the future threat environment, what we would call today as strategic planners, might be, or whether and how to structure and size your military even for uncertainty, there's just a complete bipartisan consensus that the military should be cut. And it kind of goes along with, the American way of war, which is you raise an army for a war and then you take it down after the war. Well, this was a Cold War, so when it's over, so shouldn't we get a peace dividend? So how much, for 25% reduction immediately happened while we were engaged in the Iraq War. General Powell, as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, was testifying for Congress, and he said something like, I bet I'm the only chairman in the history, of the United States or of the world that has overseen this kind of a massive reduction in our force structure while I have thousands of troops still in harm's way 8,000 miles away. But that's what we were doing. This is the sort of disconnect we had. Not even sort of making sense of, well, Iraq, are we going to have more kinds of wars like Iraq or like Somalia? Are we going to have more kinds of things like Somalia? It's just, not really clear, very much focused on closing the chapter on the Cold War. We had 2.1 million troops, and we went down to 1.6 immediately. By 1997, the force had shrunk to 1.4 million. And it was at about a third of, it had been cut by a third from its Cold War peak. 38% smaller budget by 1997. That's pretty drastic. And you're hearing lots of moaning today in the halls of the Pentagon and all over Washington about slashing the budget. This was massive. And we still had 9,000 troops in the Balkans and 3,000 troops in the Persian Gulf. It was a big challenge for the Pentagon. Meanwhile, also, there was a big debate over the future role of the military. We had a commission on roles and missions. So they're trying to get their head around what the future requires. They sort of outsource it to this roles and missions commission so that they can sort of adjudicate among the services what kinds of cuts that they should take. Peacekeeping operations were highlighted, mentioned in the report, but they're mentioned as something that is sort of a lesser mission. And critically, what they also highlighted was, and this kind of continues to come back to bite us, is that civilian agencies have a big role in peacekeeping operations. That this is not really a very appropriate role for the military, which actually is completely not in sync with the historic reality, right? I mean, the U.S. military has actually been engaged in these kinds of operations for its entire history. We had, I often like to think when we started West Point, there was a big debate that we shouldn't have a standing army, right? But Thomas Jefferson, who was against having a standing army, finally kind of came around to it. But he said, if we're going to have West Point, it should be an engineering school. Why? Yeah.
Because the French relied on that kind of training and education.
Partly. His attitude was that the military should be as useful in time of peace as it is in time of war. If we're going to spend all this money on them, they might as well be helping us build this nation. So literally building the nation from east to west. Is that what you were going to say? Yeah. Right. So that was sort of the carrots and sticks of conceding to having a standing military. So the military has been doing this their whole career. They helped keep the peace on the frontier between the settlers and the Native Americans. They conducted counterinsurgency across the West. They also were the primary keepers of the peace, doing Reconstruction after the Civil War. People forget about that, but that was it was a huge mission, and it was hugely unpopular. They were engaged in this kind of stability and reconstruction and counterinsurgency in the Philippines. We had the Marines in Haiti and the Banana Wars and the Dominican Republic. We've got them again doing reconstruction and stabilization after both World Wars. I mean, this is what the military does. It has always. So somewhere along the line, there's this new narrative that gets developed that says that the military shouldn't do this. I mean, they always hate doing it, but they have always done it. So it's not really honest to say that they haven't. So this gets more and more reinforced that the civilians should be taking part in doing this sort of thing. It gets written into the military's doctrine. Of course, nobody really told the civilian agencies, and nobody really funded the civilian agencies, so now we have this emerging sort of theme in the military about how these missions get done. The other thing happening in the Pentagon at this time is restructuring for they're doing their regular old force planning, and they're planning for 2 major theater wars was the strategy. So the idea was that we need to be able to be sized and structured and organized in order to fight 2 simultaneous wars. In where? One against Iraq and the other against North Korea. So the whole military is structured in the 90s moving forward to be able to conduct 2 simultaneous wars. One of the other reasons for that is for deterrence, to say if we're only structured for one war, then somebody could gin up some mischief in another region. So there's a lot of civil-military friction associated with the future role of the military at this time. Madeleine Albright had a lot of high hopes coming into office about UN peacekeeping. And so while the military is over there planning for 2 major theater wars, she's trying to beef up the U.S.'s role in peacekeeping with the United Nations. She's got a great debate going on with General Powell about, there's a famous quote where she says to him, what's the purpose of having this great military if you're never going to use it? But the military's attitude was, you organize, train, and equip for the big wars, and you don't waste that firepower on all this little stuff that we shouldn't be doing. This civil-military friction is also exacerbated by the Clinton administration itself. There's a huge lack of respect for President Clinton among the senior military. And for those of you who were in the military at the time, how many of you all were in the military in the 90s? I don't know if you remember this, but I remember we actually got a memo down from like the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff reminding us that it was actually inappropriate to say to badmouth the commander-in-chief because it had gotten that bad. This is also, This is also exacerbated by the gays in the military issue in the 1990s. So there's just this sort of sense among the uniformed military that these kinds of missions that they keep getting sent to do, it's just this team in the White House. It's just these guys that they're the ones that are making us do it, and when we can kind of wait them out, so we don't have to organize, train, and equip for it, and we don't have to really gather a lot of lessons about it because it'll just go away. But is that true? I mean, so there's this debate. Is it just these guys, or has something fundamentally changed in the geopolitical environment since the end of the Cold War that is going to make us need to do these kinds of missions a lot more often? And in order to answer that question, you have to sort of look back at what was going on the civilian side during this time. There had been a big debate among the boomer generation, really, about Vietnam and who served and who didn't. So there's a kind of a split. So it's hard to say that there's just the civilians and just the military because some of these perceptions kind of get blurred. But one of the things you have is in the first Gulf War, you had the perfect war, as the general pointed out, and you had President Bush really subscribing to the idea that as the commander-in-chief, I'm supposed to give the military a very specific mission and then just let them do what they need to do. And the idea of humanitarian operations was not really a big part of the issue until he starts seeing these images on TV from Somalia and the Balkans. In the Clinton administration, you have a different mentality also that may have been just generational. It's hard to say. That now that we're the sole superpower, we have this responsibility. With this great power, you have the Navy saying things like we're a force for good. We can do these kinds of things. The Clinton administration has a worldview about a liberal, multilateral environment where we should be engaging and leading in the international organizations to promote a better and more peaceful world. We created the United Nations. We should promote it. So what I also see is a trend that is divorced from U.S. domestic politics, but that influences all these things towards human rights, okay? And the human rights norms start way back in World War II with this sort of never again on the Holocaust. We're not going to let this happen. But what does that mean? We start the United Nations because we want to end war as we know it. It's a state-based system. We have humanitarian intervention challenges are not quite there yet, but it's not totally off the table. I mean, in the Reagan administration, you hear the human rights rhetoric starts to bubble up with the Helsinki Accords, where we say, people start to think it's not actually okay to abuse your citizens inside your state, right? So we have a state-based Westphalian system that says, you can't invade other countries, and that's what the United Nations is all about. But inside those countries, it's a little bit of a different story, right? And when you look at what the foundation for some of the peacekeeping missions are, there's the United Nations Charter, and there's Chapter 6 and Chapter 7, right? And you see nodding your head, what's Chapter 6 say? Anybody?
Chapter 7 is one where you force.
Yeah.
Chapter 6 says that the United Nations will respect the sovereignty of individual countries and will not enter without the permission of that country.
Right. So Chapter 6 is still based on Well, they're both based on sovereignty issues, right? And so if you are authorized to do a peacekeeping mission under Chapter 6, that means that usually there will have been some sort of a conflict and there's some sort of a peace agreement, and you're coming in as a third party to sort of be a pivot among warring parties and keep them in shape. So you're invited in. You're allowed in, to your point. Chapter 7 is more like the United Nations has authorized an international intervention because you have done something bad. You have invaded Kuwait, for instance, right? But in the 90s, there's something else going on here. We start calling these Chapter 6.5 missions. Because, we have this emerging set of norms and international law associated with human rights that says it's not cool to do really bad things to your people. But we also have this other set of norms about sovereignty. So if there's an atrocity happening, like in Bosnia or in Somalia or in Rwanda, can the international community go in without the permission of that state? And that's the Chapter 6.5 sort of thing, where you say, we're going to go in there because you're doing something inside your country that we don't like. And this is kind of a slippery slope to some people, because it's competing set of norms for, on the one hand, human rights that sort of provides the foundation for humanitarian intervention. But then the other sort of set of norms about state sovereignty, which has enabled us to keep the peace for many, many years under the United Nations system. So you see these sorts of things definitely in conflict. And my sense about the whole set of human rights norms is that it's continuing to evolve. I mean, it's continuing to go. Now we have, in the Obama administration, an emphasis on mass atrocities response and prevention. And the Obama administration is the first one to have actually a senior director in the White House for mass atrocities. And this is definitely a legacy of the 1990s, specifically of Rwanda. You had a lot of the people in the Obama administration were present during that time, and they said to themselves, we're never going to let this happen again. I mean, you had Hillary Clinton, you have Susan Rice, who is now the National Security Advisor. She was the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, and she was also the Senior Director for Africa during the Clinton administration. And then you have Samantha Power. Does anybody know who Samantha Power is? Who's Samantha Power? Mm-hmm. Right. Samantha Power literally wrote the book on genocide. She wrote a book called A Problem from Hell, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it was basically about how these genocides happen. Rwanda is one chapter in the book, but it was a pretty serious chapter because it says basically that it was a failure in Washington and in the UN that allowed this thing to happen. And so she is Obama's senior director for mass atrocities. She's now the ambassador to the UN, presiding over mass atrocities in Syria and in other places. So it's definitely a trend that isn't going away. So what they've done in the White House is they have a mass atrocities prevention and response board, which is supposed to notice when these bad things are happening and then kind of, try to prevent them, okay? And, you could make the case that some of these things have been prevented, but it's a counterfactual, so it's hard to demonstrate. Meanwhile, I was in the Pentagon while they were coming up with this, and I kept saying, well, you keep saying that you want a mass atrocities prevention board because you don't want to have to send in the military. But if you send in the military, then what? Because what can the military do to stop a genocide in its tracks? Or what can the military do to prevent genocide? And this is a huge issue. And it's becoming an even bigger issue because now we have the last sort of latest, I would say, development on the human rights trend is the responsibility to protect doctrine, which is an international agreement that signed on by most countries that says exactly what I said before, only in writing, that you as a sovereign nation have a responsibility to protect the people in your country from violence and abuse. And so by saying that and by signing on to it, if you don't do that, that gives the international community a hook or a right to intervene. And this is a big step, actually, and it's another one of these steps in the progress that has led from the 1990s. So, what is the military role in all of these things, and how has the military, or is the military, coping? Well, on the military side, throughout the 1990s, they came to the 1990s with a very different set of baggage, right? As we heard earlier, the Vietnam War was a huge influence on an entire generation. The Vietnam syndrome, in many ways, drives everything. After the Vietnam War, the military was hollowed out, and the military did an amazing job rebuilding itself. And we heard some of this before from the general, and I write about this in my book. One of the things that the military did was they had a very short debate about the Vietnam War and whether or not it was, the right kind of war. And they decided that they needed to focus on air-land battle. They needed to focus on the right kind of war, and they did. And they started the national training centers, and they started the Center for Lessons Learned, and they wrote this doctrine, and it was an incredible top-down process that literally changed the organizational culture and the mindset of the military. And it was really an amazing sort of thing. It was based on practicing. This is a kind of an amazing, practicing major tank-on-tank battles. This is an audacious idea, right? We're gonna just practice large-scale battles out in the desert of California at the National Training Center. This idea was based on the Air Force's and the Navy's air training, where they said, if you can practice, if in Vietnam they had learned that they had a lot of statistics about the pilots in Vietnam, and they learned that if a pilot sort of survived his first month, he was more likely to survive the whole year, right? And so they said to themselves, what's happening in that first month? And how can we recreate that first month in a safer environment and then send them to Vietnam? And that's what started Top Gun and Nellis, Red Flag, and that whole sort of learning environment. So they would recreate or simulate a battle, and they would have a massive after-action review where they would get to the ground truth about exactly what happened so that they could learn from it. And then they would send them. So the Army said, that's cool, let's do that with tanks, right? And they created their own massive training center out in the desert of California to do just that. And it's really an amazing, we take it for granted now that the Army has this big lessons learned system, but it is pretty impressive, and it enabled them to inject this new way of war and then teach it to an entire generation. And as the general pointed out earlier, they got their chance to do it in Iraq. And that's exactly what they did. And so that says to this generation of military that that's the right kind of war. Vietnam was the wrong kind of war. In addition, you have the Powell Doctrine coming out of this Vietnam syndrome that is based on the idea that the generals had that we're never going to let this happen again. We're not going to let the civilians drag us into some quagmire. We're going to make sure that, as Colin Powell said, that we're going to keep the mission clear and doable, and we're going to leave when it's done. Okay, so the Powell Doctrine said that we had to have an end state, had to be clearly defined, that there has to be domestic political will, or it has to be able to be generated, that you can use overwhelming force, and that you can get in and get out as soon as possible. So this is the Powell Doctrine, which some people would say is really not his doctrine to write because it's more about policy than it is about war fighting. But this is the mindset of the military coming into the 90s. And that their mission is to fight and win the nation's war, and the way they're going to do it is with air-land battle, joint operations, and the Powell Doctrine. This is in stark contrast to what is actually happening during the 90s, which is Somalia, Haiti, and the Balkans, and an entire generation over and over again being deployed to these regions. So there's a series of takeaways from these missions. Peacekeeping operations are hard, and we don't like them. Just like in Vietnam, it's like COIN, it's like counterinsurgency. We're not going to do them. The Bush administration, the second Bush administration, and Condi Rice, they actually ridiculed the missions in the Balkans. Condi Rice was famously said, soldiers should not be walking kids to kindergarten, which is part of the mission that they were doing in the Balkans to kind of keep the peace. And they were going to back off on all of this. And that was welcome news to the military who didn't want to do it. And meanwhile, Secretary Rumsfeld was going to focus on network-centric warfare. He was going to move forward. It was going to be high-end. I mean, you see this same sort of thing happening that happened after Vietnam. The biggest myth that comes out of this issue, of this era that I already discussed, is that civilians can do this kind of mission, and they will do it. And so I think you have this, you have competing narratives. The military wrote all this into their doctrine, okay, that this is the way you fight war, and that the civilians are going to be doing the cleanup in the aftermath. And the uncomfortable truth about all this is that it's not how it actually happens. So while this debate is happening in Washington, and while this doctrine is getting written, and while this generation is being taught about the future of war, the other generation is actually conducting these operations. Some 40% of the people that went to Haiti also went to Somalia. The General Purpose Force has been completely mainstreamed into this. General Petraeus and General Corelli and others who were battalion commanders end up being, generals in the next Iraq War. And so you have these mixed strategic and political messages. You have all these tactical lessons that everybody's learning on the ground, and then on how to cope with these environments, but then you have all these other messages that say that it's not your real mission. So how does this all pan out when we end up going into Iraq in 2003? Well, what's interesting is that, remember that whole learning system that I talked about that happened after Vietnam, where they made the national training centers, and the whole idea was to learn in a fast loop? Well, this generation was doing that. They were taking their lessons from Somalia, Haiti, and the Balkans, and they were feeding them back into the training centers. And they were practicing them, even though people weren't really paying that much attention. So that when Iraq kicked off, you had the senior leadership saying, good job, you drove to Baghdad, you toppled Saddam, it's time to come home. But you had people like General Petraeus and General Corelli starting to conduct nation building in their little patches, in their little areas. And the way they did that was because they could leverage their experience from what happened in the 90s. And it was feeding back into their learning systems. So ironically, the system that was created after Vietnam to teach air-land battle to a generation was then used to teach the peacekeeping operations and counterinsurgency then in Iraq. So where does this all take us today? Well, there's a huge debate going on among people. I'm not going to talk in detail about Iraq. I think we're doing that tomorrow. But there's a huge debate going on right now about the future of the military. And here we go again, right? We're going to downsize after 2 wars. We're going to debate about the future of war. And we're going to have to try to find a balance between learning the lessons from the past, which would be Iraq and the 90s. And are these the kinds of missions that we want our military to do? Or are these the kinds of missions that we aren't going to have a choice that they'll have to do? Or or should we be focusing on a future threat, high-end, anti-access area denial, as Mike talked about this morning, high-tech, near-peer competitor like China? Or can we do both at the same time? And this is the challenge that we're facing the Pentagon right now. If you are to study this sort of thing, and if you are trying to determine what the military is focused on, a lot of people will look at the budget. And we talked about this morning. I think some of you all asked this question of Mike. You know, where's the military putting its money? Are they going to be focusing on peacekeeping and the kind of missions against non-traditional asymmetric threats, or are they going to put all their money in this high-tech, groovy, robotics and stuff like that? Well, if you try to infer just by looking at what you're investing in, you're going to miss the point. Because for these kinds of missions, for peacekeeping, for counterinsurgency, the beauty and the beast of these missions is that they actually don't require a lot of the super high-end weapons. I mean, you can still use a C-17 to conduct these missions. You can still use the same kind of tanks and weapons. What makes you successful in these kinds of missions is your doctrine, your training, your education, and your leadership. You could have the same battalion commander trained in air-land battle or also well-versed in counterinsurgency and peacekeeping operations. And you're not going to pick that up just by trying to determine whether we're buying enough aircraft carriers or enough jets. And so I find this is one of the big mistakes a lot of researchers make and a lot of pundits make. If you really want to know where the military is focused, you've got to talk to the professors in the war colleges in the back of the room. So I think I'll stop right there and open it up for your questions. We can talk about the future of war and whether or not we think that the military is going to get it right this time around. So, thanks.
Thank you very much. We'll begin with Paul Dickler.
Paul Dickler, FPRI. Hi. Thanks very much for the talk. Sure. I have 2 immediate questions after it. One is you referred to the politicization within the Army during the Clinton administration, and you're getting even more of that under the Obama administration. Yeah. So one question is this a function of a volunteer Army, the politicization, against one party or in favor of another? And secondly, what's your final assessment on the success or failure of the missions on your topic?
Very interesting question. I'll take the second one first. I think we were more successful in Haiti and the Balkans than we were in Somalia, that's for sure. I think we got spooked in Somalia, and I think we learned a huge lesson in Somalia, which was a Clausewitzian lesson, which is don't get into, the first mission before you go is to know what kind of operation you're getting yourself into, what kind of war are you getting yourself into. There's a narrative about Somalia that I think is wrong. The narrative is, we went in there to stop a famine, it was a humanitarian mission, and then we switched to a nation-building mission, and when we did that, it all went to hell. Well, the real truth is, the real lesson from Somalia is that if the famine is driven by conflict among warlords, and you come in and stop a famine, then you leave, it's not going to change anything. So you should know that before you go in, because you're not going to actually fix the situation. And I know that's what people found themselves in. With Haiti and Bosnia, or in the Balkans, I think we've done a much better job. The Balkans has been one of the big lessons, I think, from the Balkans is that I think people need to take note of as we try to transition out of Afghanistan is that how long it takes. These things take a long time. And I think this is what sort of is spooking people now. They don't want to get involved in any of these kinds of things because they know how long that they'll take.
If I could just comment there. I mean, I agree with what you just said about the Balkans. I guess I disagree on both Somalia and Haiti. I saw Somalia as highly successful and Haiti as a failure. But that's because 18 Americans died and 2 million people didn't starve to death. And the famine was broken after the operation. And I have to give Bush mainly the credit because he's the one that started it. And as far as Haiti goes, Haiti appears to be just as bad or worse today as it was then.
Yeah. So that's an interesting point because Somalia is pretty bad today too. So it's, the question is, what problem are you trying to solve in all of these things? I mean, I take your point because if you're trying to solve a famine, good job. If you're trying to turn Afghanistan into Sweden, you're going to be there for a long time. But if you take a look at what Afghanistan's another great example. If you take a look at what Afghanistan was like in 2000 or 2001, Peter Bergen has written about this versus today, on all measures, education, literacy, cell phone usage, economics, infant mortality, on and on, off the charts progress. So that drives the great question of Afghanistan, which is, when is our mission done? Like, when have we done enough? And so my sense is we've probably done enough. The challenge is, how do you transition out? And that's where, in Bosnia, we transitioned very slowly over a long period of time. And if you look at the slope plan for Afghanistan, it's like this. And that's the recipe for instability. So that could be pretty bad. Your point on civil-military relations between the White House and the Pentagon, it's a pet issue of mine, actually. And I think that, in fact, they're always kind of messed up. Actually, there's always this trust deficit between the White House and the Pentagon. Kennedy had it in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Truman had a hell of a time convincing the military to do the Berlin airlift, which now everybody thinks was such a great idea. So they're constantly having pushback. Similar kind of pushback that Obama has with the Pentagon about numbers. How many troops in Afghanistan? And the generals are trying to get one over on me, and this and that. And that's all bad, and I was in the Pentagon, and I saw a lot of it. But I tell you what, it's nothing like the attitude against Clinton in the 90s that I experienced. I mean, pot smoking, hippies telling us to go to all these crazy places. I mean, it was really, really bad.
But all four of your examples were Democrats. Can you give any Republican examples?
Yeah, I mean, Bush and Rumsfeld had a hell of a time with the military as well. Rumsfeld, especially, I mean, it's an administration, right? Rumsfeld famously lining out the plan for Iraq and browbeating all the generals, and Bush, when he was trying to save the Iraq war in the height of the violence in 2006 and 2007, completely rejected the Pentagon's plans and went with, Jack Keane and some think tankers who came up with this idea for the surge and basically shoved it down their throats, and they were very unhappy. So, yeah, I mean, you have it. Eisenhower also complained a lot. I've written about this issue. I think there's a perennial disconnect. And I actually think, to be fair to everybody involved, I actually think it's institutional and cultural. We want to make it out like it's personality driven because that's sexy in Bob Woodward's book, and it makes for an interesting narrative. But really, I mean, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Plans, it was like constantly, I felt like I was watching an I Love Lucy show, like where people are talking past each other, and you can see it. Like, I can see the generals thinking that they're answering this one question, but the president actually wanting answers to a different question. And it's constantly like that with war plans. The president wants options. And when he wants options, he wants, like, what do you think we could do? And the military is like, what? Tell me what you want done, and I'll tell you how to do it. And it's just this complete crash. And Admiral Mullen was for instance, during the Libya crisis, loath to put in front of the president some half-baked, back-of-the-envelope list of options because, he hasn't had time to actually vet them and figure out whether, when you're doing a real war plan, you actually have to war game it, and you have to figure out whether you have the resources. You have to do this thing called a TIPFID, which is the time phase force deployment data thing, which says where every plane's going to go. It's like a science. And so that it becomes a big problem. There's this institutional process that spits out an answer to a question that is like this one exquisitely developed plan. And the president's like, okay, well, what else do you got? And they're like, well, we need another couple months to come up with that. So it happens in every administration, and it's a fascinating and frustrating dilemma.
Shelley Sally from Austin, Texas. Turn on your microphone.
I really like the way you characterized these events in the 1990s and this zeal to do something and then backlash against peacekeeping missions. How do you think the rise of global terrorism is changing that equation about what peacekeeping looks like in terms of strategy?
So it's a little bit of apples and oranges, but I kind of get where you're going at, because there's a sense that this is a different kind of mission that the military is getting called on to do, right? Peacekeeping in these kinds of operations require lots of boots on the ground to kind of create stability out of chaos. In fact, it's in some ways the enemy is actually the environment itself, right? Haiti, Somalia, Bosnia, Iraq, Afghanistan. It's just there's so many. It's a big system and it's a big mess. Terrorism is a little bit different, right? And terrorism to me represents another trend that I didn't talk about that I think is going to become sort of the mood music of national security planning for the next couple decades, and that is this blurring of the line between what we consider crime and what we consider war. You have this as a big problem in, in international law and with our allies who see terrorism as criminal behavior, like trafficking and piracy, and other people who see it as war. And, I can kind of make the case for either. Al-Qaeda literally did declare war on us. And so maybe our international legal structures associated with what we consider to be war are a little outdated, right? Because everything we know to be true about war, from an international law perspective, if you read the laws of war, is about nation states, right? And they're really explicit. Like, the laws of war say you got to wear a uniform, and it has to have the insignia on it, and you have to declare war, and it's just like, when was the last time we had a war like that? Not very much. And when you look at what's happening in Ukraine, who are these guys, right? Putin can say, they're not my guys. They're not, they're like masked men, with like suspiciously well armed with Russian, special forces equipment, but, they're not Putin's guys. So are they terrorists? Are they special forces? Are they combatants? It's just a big blurred line. And so what the U.S. has done is it's taken two different approaches, two phases at least. The first phase was after 9/11, we've dealt with terrorism for a long time, was, okay, we got struck by terrorists, we need to find a nation state to attack, right? So it'll be Afghanistan, right? Because that allows us to do it and also go after those guys, because we couldn't put it in our head and figure out a legal way to have a war against a non-state actor, which would be Al-Qaeda, right? So then we had that war in Afghanistan, and we also had what was called the GWAT, the Global War on Terror, right? Which was also highly criticized, because how do you have a war against terror? It's like a war on drugs or a war on poverty, and so there was all this blah, blah, blah about it. And then the next phase was, okay, we're not going to have a war on terror. We're going to actually, if you read the White House counterterrorism strategy now, we're actually going to have a war against Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. So now there's all this blah, blah, blah about what's an affiliate. And if you raise your hand in Mali and say, I want to join the Al-Qaeda franchise, do you get a drone on your head? And is that a deterrent? I mean, these are the kinds of debates that we have. From the militaries, and it's become very much of a CIA war, which is a different issue. From the military perspective, I think what you're going to see going forward is the counterterrorism approach will be very much a SOF mission, Special Operations Forces, SOCOM. Admiral McCraven, who's the commander of SOCOM, was like the guy that got bin Laden. He's got a whole counterterrorism strategy, and I think that it's very appealing to civilians who see it as like not very expensive, nothing to see here, we'll take care of it. So there are a lot of issues associated with terrorism going forward, and the degree to which it's a military mission, I think, will continue to be debated.
We'll go to John Underwood.
Thank you. I have a question with the reality that peacekeeping and nation building isn't going to go away anytime soon, and the inherent mistrust between the different IGOs, NGOs, civilian organizations that render aid. The Army's doctrinal shift, from about 2000 to 2010 with the humanitarian operations centers, did that seem to help at any from your perspective with that integration, using the civilians to help out with nation building and peacekeeping?
No. So I have my own sort of response to that, because there are a lot of days, weeks, months of my life I'll never get back, having tried to work that very issue, the interagency coordination for peacekeeping, stability operations, counterinsurgency. So what I learned was that after Somalia, especially, there was a big after-action review. And that combined with a lot of the basic learning that happened after that, one of the big takeaways were that there are all these civilians on the ground. It's their job, and therefore it should be the USAID's job. And so the military then wrote that into their doctrine, Joint Publication 3-8. Was in the 90s the publication for interagency operations. So if you read that manual, if you were a person who worked in USAID, Agency for International Development, you would be surprised to learn that the military has tasked you with all these things when it comes to peacekeeping and stability operations that you actually don't really have the mojo to carry out. And so what we did was we taught an entire generation of military leaders that they were going to have State Department and USAID force multipliers with them, digging wells, kickstarting provinces, and basically conducting counterinsurgency and stability operations, when really they never showed up. And then you probably experienced this. People were really mad about it. Like, where are the civilians? Well, they would always ask me, where are the civilians? And I kept saying, well, who taught you that they were coming? Because nobody told them. So it's been a really difficult couple decades, because the expectations don't match reality. And that narrative, that theme, that belief that this is a civilian job was so pervasive, the civilians believed it too. And the State Department signed up for a big role in the provincial reconstruction teams for Iraq and Afghanistan, where they would be the civilians and the military working side by side in provinces all over Iraq and all over Afghanistan. But then they had no civilians available to do it. And they actually, I had a PowerPoint one time, when I used to use PowerPoint, that actually had a memo that was sent across to the Pentagon from the State Department. Right after the Secretary of State signed up for this PRT mission, she solicited volunteers from the Pentagon to do it, because she didn't have any. So I don't think that's going to get better anytime soon. And the last reason I'll say it won't get better anytime soon is that even if we believe it is a civilian job, and even if the civilians want to do it, and some of them do, Congress has demonstrated for the last 20 years that they will not fund the State Department to do that mission. For whatever reason, they just won't. And so it's just going to continue to fall on the military. It will continue to fall to them.
I don't believe it is a civilian-only mission. I mean, and I was sitting here talking about it and saying, I really have to talk with Dr. Davis later on when this is over, because I was the Hawk Kuwait Sergeant Major and the only one, and I was a CMO Sergeant Major for a couple of years, and it worked, but there was that inherent mistrust. Because you had a room full of people with all these different civilian organizations, including the UN. Why can't we just cross the border? Why can't we do this? You can, but you have to tell us when and where and what you're taking, so we can pass that information up through the general purpose forces, so you don't cross the line and somebody think you're a terrorist because you're in a vehicle that nobody recognizes.
So that's a slightly different issue. So I was talking about the expectations that our military has, that their civilian counterparts in the government will be with them in these missions. What you're talking about is the CMOC, the Civil Military Operations Cell, whatever. The military, after Somalia, came up with these mechanisms where when there's a big crisis and everybody gets on the ground and there's all kinds of people running all around, the military would set up this coordination cell. But it's voluntary, because these NGOs, these non-governmental organizations, like everything from Mercy Corps to the Red Cross to whoever, they can come, but they have a whole different mindset about whether working with the military will make them safer or not, or less safe. And I did work on, and this was a bright light. There's a what's it called? Like a big organization, an organization of organizations, whatever that's called, consortium, I guess, of NGOs who have agreed to sign up. And we, the military, the Joint Staff, the U.S. Institute of Peace, and the Pentagon, and came up with military NGO guidelines, so that the NGOs could work with the military in these operations and know what the rules of the road were. And so both sides took 2 years to determine this tiny little handbook. And we wrote that into doctrine. But not all NGOs would sign up for it, because many of them don't think that it's... So it's an inherent conundrum, but I think that across the sort of humanitarian ecosystem of people and community of practice that do this stuff, military, aid workers, and everything, the last 20 years especially has been a lot of learning, and there is more trust in some areas. There's trust for disasters more so than for development. In disasters, everybody's sort of like all power to the engines, we're all working together, but after a period of time, they want the military to leave, and they want the development people to take over. So,
Can I ask you a question about President Obama's decision to finally send troops to get Coney, and also our inactivity in Darfur? At what point I have 16-year-olds who come to me and talk about Coney. They saw 2012, and they also ask about the Janjaweed, and I lead a group, Save Darfur. I've been involved in it for years. At what point does the American political will shift to actually sending, Ospreys into Uganda, or the absence of troops into Sudan? And is that the future of the American military primarily?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that, the unsatisfying answer is that it depends. And it depends on a lot of things. I mean, this is why the sort of mood music and geopolitical and domestic political environment really matters. So, like what I talked about right after the Cold War, there was this sense that the Russians went out of business, we can do whatever we want, we should do good stuff. And so there was this push to want to do stuff like that, right? Until we saw people getting killed in Somalia, and we realized that it's kind of hard and it's kind of more dangerous than we thought. And so then you see the domestic political opinion going like this, completely seesawing, right? And so you have that, and that weighs heavily on the president and Congress. And they have Congress was the one that yanked the money for Somalia the first time they'd used the War Powers Act since Vietnam, in fact, the only time, really. It's usually the president making these decisions. And every president's different. And Clinton had a fairly big enough appetite to do a lot of this stuff. Bush had a small appetite and then a big appetite. And Obama has had sort of like a not so much appetite, right? And meanwhile, our allies, same thing ever since the economic crisis. And so I think what motivates Americans is Americans don't want to see really, really bad stuff like that. I mean, the atrocities that are happening, but, you know, how much media attention did Sudan get last week with the massacres that happened? Bodies piling up on the street, and we're still talking about Malaysia Flight 370 24/7 on CNN. So, I mean, it's fickle. And I don't have a really good answer for you.
I'm afraid on that note, we're going to have to end. Thank you very much, Janine Davis.